entity charged with new business attraction to the island. So earlier in the morning, for those folks that were here in the morning, you heard Rod Miller, who's the CEO, talking a bit about what we do. But essentially, our mission is to promote Puerto Rico as a competitive investment jurisdiction to attract new investment, capital investment, and new business to the island. And so it is my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ricky, for the invitation. And with that, I would like to welcome to the stage our panelists, Ricardo Alvarez-Diaz and Emilio Colon-Zavala. Please join me. Gentlemen, before I begin, I'd love to give you the opportunity to introduce yourselves and a bit about what you do for the benefit of the audience here. So Ricardo, if you could.
I co-founded an architecture and interior design firm, but for some reason I never talk about architecture, so we're going to talk about other stuff today. I was a member of Invest Puerto Rico, ex-chair of the Builders Association. I'm happily married and I have 3 kids. Is that good?
That's great.
My social security number.
Emilio?
Yes, my name is Emilio Colon-Zavala. I am a professionally licensed engineer here in Puerto Rico. I have my own engineering services, construction management and development firm in Puerto Rico. I am the immediate past chair of the Puerto Rico Builders Association. I came right after Ricardo. We are with the Puerto Rico Builders Association. It's the National Association of Home Builders local chapter, as well as the Urban Institute. In addition to that, I was tasked with chairing the Local Workers Innovation and Opportunities Act State Board here in Puerto Rico. So I've been doing a lot of things lately. Happily married also, just 1 kid, 7 years old.
I'm sorry, that was a bad joke.
Ricardo, do you want to reevaluate your response after Emilio spoke? I'm kidding. He's humble.
It's been a long day. I'm pretty sure that I'm tired.
He's humble. Ricardo actually has, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, architecture firm here in Puerto Rico, and he's a humble man. But so the name of this panel is The Road to Resilience, right? And I feel this is a buzzword that we've been hearing a lot, and one that is really used lately to describe Puerto Rico. And so I ask you, Emilio, what does this word mean to you? And how have you seen this quality play out in Puerto Rico from an economic perspective?
Well, resiliency, which is like the in-word for the last 2.5 years, is the textbook definition is for something to come back to its original state after being in a stress situation. So how does it apply to Puerto Rico? And Ricardo and I were talking about this. I think we shouldn't strive to just come back to where we were 2.5 years ago. I think that for Puerto Rico, resiliency should be coming back better and stronger than we were in 2017. And it's important, yes, that some things have happened in the last few years, but I think it's time that we turn the page and look outwards and see if we can get a renaissance and do like the phoenix and rise from the ashes and be better than we were 2.5 years ago.
And I feel that this is a quality that has often been described to describe Puerto Rico and its citizens and Puerto Ricans. Have you seen examples of this in the past couple of years, given the hurricanes and the earthquakes and all sorts of situations? Could you think about a couple examples where you saw Puerto Ricans and their resilience? Because it definitely is something that has it's almost like this quality has kind of emerged out of need, right? But it really does show the great quality that the island does have. So if any of you could just give me, think of examples that can show, investors here how resilient
people don't complain.
Well, I guess I'll say this: we should look back, not only Irma and Maria, because as it's been. Most people have known we have been in an economic downturn since 2006. And I make a joke out of it, but we've talked about it. I think people should just create a hall of fame of every single business in Puerto Rico that still not only survived but thrived after this whole downturn. And in a way, when you talk about resiliency, in my opinion, I know that the textbook definition is what Emilio said, and Emilio and I both agree, that you have to go beyond, because you can't just go back to what things were. And one thing I can tell you, you said I was humble, so I'm going to be self-serving now. I'm going to talk about our experience. In 2006 to 2007, especially 2008, when you're involved in the construction industry, you know what happened in 2008. So the reality, in our case, the fact that we were able to kind of reassess where we were and take advantages of the fact that things were so limited, it forced us to stop looking inward and start looking outward. What was happening all over the world? 2011 was great because that's when what we all have come to know as Law 20 was created. And we were the first architectural interior design firm in the island that actually got the decree. So in 2012, we realized, wow, we have this great decree, and now we have to find a way to use it, because we didn't have that much work outside of the island. So, and this all happened before Irma and Maria. I think what Irma and Maria did is that it kind of forced us to do things faster. But the reality is that any of us that have been in Puerto Rico for a long time, and we are actually, running our own businesses, the Puerto Rican people in general have proven to be resilient under all sorts of issues. I mean, I made a joke that was actually a terrible joke, because I said we've been through bankruptcies, hurricanes, and earthquakes. And I think I was in New York, and I said something, well, we're just hoping that we can get a meteor. And we did. So a couple of days later, the journalist sent me a picture of the meteor, and I was like, Jesus, and of course the journalist asked me for the lotto numbers to see if I knew them too. But at the end of the day, the fact that we have been through so much, it forces you to actually think outside the box and think of how to be more efficient, how to find ways to do things a little differently and not only survive but thrive.
I think this word resilient, being a leader in the economic development practice now for Puerto Rico, you start analyzing all the value propositions that the island has had for decades and decades. And it's interesting because I was watching a video, I think it was of the 60s, and it was a great, amazing video in a time where Puerto Rico was the glamorous time of Puerto Rico was very sexy and people were coming here. But it made me think that the value proposition has not changed. It hasn't changed over decades. And I think now we have a true opportunity to kind of really dig deep into what is really the value proposition of Puerto Rico. And I think one thing that we can say now is this element that we can add to that value proposition is the fact that we are resilient. And that is something that, whether for companies to come here, it's a very important quality, the fact that we've been through a lot, but the quality of Puerto Ricans to be resilient is actually something that's very attractive to businesses when they're considering Puerto Rico. So we heard earlier from the government perspective regarding the road to recovery. We had Dennis Gonzalez earlier here today talk about CDBG-DR funds, which are disaster recovery funds. But I want to talk a bit more about the private sector. What can, Ricardo, from your perspective, what can the private sector do to really accelerate transformation?
Well, I think it's a fairly simple answer when it comes to federal funding. Just follow the rules. Because we were both a couple of hours ago. We met with Admiral Brown, and the reality is that in Puerto Rico we're dealing with perception. We all know it. We are dealing with a president that says that Puerto Rico is the most corrupt place in the world next to Ukraine. He tweets that. So we have to fight that, and that is perception. But guess what? I don't want to quote Top Gun because I'll be dating myself. But we have to be doing it better and cleaner than everything that we've done before. So what the private sector can do is that not to fight those limitations, both to embrace them, but to embrace them and actually do it right. And then slowly, we're going to get the trust back. Is it fair? Who cares? No one is asking what's fair. Okay? I'm pretty sure that the people from Haiti were not asking about fairness because they didn't have a chance to get the federal amount of federal funding that we're getting today and will continue to get. So the private sector needs to accept the fact that we need to do things better. We need to follow the rules and prove to the world what we already know. And by the way, guys, let's remind ourselves of this, because Puerto Ricans are very good sometimes at putting ourselves down. We say things, I don't know, we're the best, but truly, we don't really believe it sometimes. And I'll tell you what I mean. There has been 3 indictments regarding reconstruction funding. Reconstruction funding, okay? Let's not talk about other federal funding. 3 indictments. And none of them are from Puerto Ricans. 2 of them were federal employees from Atlanta, and 1 was a CEO of an American company. Where is the corruption coming from the reconstruction funding? So yes, is it unfair? Yes, it's unfair. So let's prove the world that we can do it right. And the guidelines are clear. As private leaders, we need to make sure we follow the rules and actually prove that we can do it right.
Yeah, I think this is a case where the rhetoric does not match the facts at the end of the day. And we just need to accept what the rhetoric is, whatever the misconceptions might be out there, and turn it on its head. There's a Spanish saying, says, vira la tortilla, right? Which is turn it on its head in English. And what we just need to do is work with the tools we have, make the best of it, and show the world how qualified we are to build that better our island from whatever has happened in the last 2.5 years.
Yeah, and I do want to touch upon the whole idea of dispelling myths a bit later on in the conversation, but Emilio, as you know, you were past chair of the Puerto Rico Home Builders Association, and actually you both have been very heavily involved in nonprofit organizations. And so my question, we know that the private sector, but talking about the other types of sectors, right? How can the nonprofit sector and industry associations such as the Home Builders Association really help also enable this recovery and this transformation for Puerto Rico?
Well, I think the third sector, or the NFTs, really have the opportunity to fill in the gaps. There are gaps that the government won't fill because of their intrinsicies and however they operate. And the private sector also has some things that per se private companies will not fill. So I think the not-for-profits come in between, and they can do a lot of things that normally the government won't look at, or the private sector will not get immersed in. And I'll give you one example. Last year, we were talking about workforce development in Puerto Rico, especially for construction, because of the need of construction workers who would be properly trained for all of the reconstruction work. So the Puerto Rico Builders Association, under Ricardo's leadership, established a not-for-profit organization to really work within the communities. So what we did is we established a pre-apprenticeship program in the public school system, and we graduated and certified around 320 students that are certified now to work in the construction industry. Of those 320 students, 150 got a carpenter's certificate for them to earn more money as a carpenter or a carpenter's assistant in the construction industry. So that is one example where a group of private entities form a not-for-profit organization, partner with the public sector in order to give students the tools they need to be work ready when they leave high school. And it's just one example. Other examples could be impacting communities, and giving this at the community level, helping them. We also did a resiliency manual with enterprise communities, so that people, not only professionals here in Puerto Rico, but even the common people who are not engineers or architects can understand what can they do in their own homes to be better prepared for a natural disaster. We even did a pamphlet with a sort of a do-it-yourself kind of thing, done by professional architects and engineers to do that. So there is a lot of things that can happen from the not-for-profit level sector that can help the communities be ready, because at the end of the day, the communities are the first line of defense when these things happen.
I absolutely agree on the importance of the nonprofit sector. In fact, Invest Puerto Rico in and of itself is a nonprofit organization, and we essentially assumed the responsibility that the government had for new business attraction, and we see ourselves as kind of that, the entity that can interconnect the private sector and the public sector and academia, and all these things working together are really going to accelerate, because no one entity can do it alone, right? We all need to work together here. Regarding the road to recovery, Emilio, how do you think that the road to recovery here is different from other emerging economies? What advantages does Puerto Rico have vis-a-vis others?
I think federal funding could be the biggest advantage. We complain about bureaucracy and how everything is red tape and slow, but you see our neighbors, which they don't have the tools that we get access to in terms of being able to have the resources to first respond to a natural disaster and then recover to it. I think the biggest challenge we're going to have is to implement lessons learned and have the will to finally do it. But I think we have some tools to recover that our neighbors don't really have. And you can probably see in the newspaper how everyone complains about 2.5 years since Hurricane Maria, and 20,000 people still under a blue tarp, which is not great news. But Ricardo was talking about Haiti. When the Haiti earthquake happened, the road to recovery was way worse than what we've had. They had, I told Ricardo I wasn't going to talk about a lot of natural disasters, but we need to understand that natural disasters come in 3 cycles. First comes the natural occurrence, you name it, flood, hurricane, earthquake, or whatever it is that happens, or fire. Then comes the humanitarian health disaster because of lack of access to health. And finally, it comes the economic disaster when people start losing their jobs. And I think that on Maria, it was bigger, but we had some of the 3 happen in one degree or another. For this one, the earthquakes, even though it was more localized than a Hurricane Maria, we did not really have a health issue. We are dealing with the economics on a certain place of the island, but I think the road has been quicker than it was before, and it is very in part due to not-for-profit organizations who took up the lead where the gap needed to be filled.
And I think that's important for folks, to understand, is that our road to recovery does have advantages over other jurisdictions. So despite the fact that you may see some things in the media, and we really do have some tools, like you said, that will accelerate this transformation going forward.
I do want to add to this, because we all forget that when Katrina hit in 2005, it took almost 3 years for funding to start to flow in Louisiana. The same thing happened after Superstorm Sandy. It took a year and almost 2 years. And again, in the case of Puerto Rico, funding is actually started to come in. So the second question I hear, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, is that, okay, so we're getting some funding. How come we haven't used it all? Well, it takes time, and you want to do it right. At the beginning, it's a slow process. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of mechanisms that you need to actually follow in order to make sure that you can minimize levels of corruption. But once that happens, you're going to start seeing a lot of things start to occur very, very, very fast. So, what is the advantage? Going back to Emilio's point, is the fact that we are we as part of the U.S., we have a resource for us to get us into actually recovery. And if we look at other situations in the U.S., we're not necessarily that different. I think that perception, again, has a lot to do with it. And to be fair, guys, it is true. Over 3,000 people died. And just as a reminder, I keep saying this, that's more people than 9/11. And I think we all have a responsibility to look at this, at the advantages of the relationship with the U.S. And actually use those funds in a way that makes sense. Not because we feel we have to do it, because we have a responsibility to every single one of those people who passed away. So what are the advantages? They're enormous. If you've had a chance to go anywhere in the world that been through any type of situation like the ones we've been through, it's been 10, 15 years and they have not necessarily recovered. So we will definitely recover.
And there is more appetite to invest here in Puerto Rico that there has been in the same amount of time in the other places where they have.
That is a very good point. If you look at the amount of investment that came to Louisiana right after Katrina, by percentages and by the amount of people and by the level, I'll give you an example of things that happened. After Katrina, 250,000 people left New Orleans. In Puerto Rico, almost 410,000. Within a year and a half, almost all 400,000 people that left came back to the island. To this day, New Orleans have not recovered from the loss of those 250,000. There still are under 150,000 people that never came back. That is a big deal. And the amount of funding that came was minimal in contrast to the amount of funds, not only federal, but private investing that you're seeing happening within the first 3 years after the hurricane.
Ricardo, you mentioned recently in a publication that, and I quote, the housing industry is a significant indicator of economic resurgence. It reflects investor confidence. And you also stated that we need to shift perception of housing development to community development. Can you elaborate a bit of this, elaborate on this statement, and what role can investors play in this?
Well, I mean, it's very simple. I mean, we lived it. Right after the hurricane, and within the first 2 weeks, FEMA wasn't around. So what helped, Puerto Ricans move forward? It was the community. It was every single one of us helping each other. So when people talk about, hey, we need more houses, we need to build more houses, that's a problem. Because you don't need to build more houses, you need to build more communities. Because I'll give you an example. I don't know if you know, but in Puerto Rico 2.5 years ago after the hurricane, there was a bridge in Utuado that collapsed. That bridge, it was actually rebuilt by the Corps of Engineers within 6 months. And it cost $4 million to rebuild. You know how many houses actually that bridge led to? Anyone?
2 houses.
4. 4. So you basically got $1 million each. And you know the problem? It's not the houses, it's the location of those houses. Your house might not have been affected at all, but if it's in a flood zone or it's in an area that's limited, you can't get out or you can't get in. So you need to start focusing on planning and actually rebuilding communities, not houses, because what's going to happen is that you're going to get some federal funding, you're going to rebuild your house, and you're going to have the same problem when we get hit again. Right. Because the house wasn't affected, but the environment was. So when you're thinking of reinvesting, you have to reinvest in how to create a community that not only physically actually has a more dense environment, but psychologically you feel that someone's going to have your back, someone's going to help you. So it works as a planning tool as well as a psychological tool. And by the way, and as an investment opportunity, if you're going to invest, it's a better investment to invest in a community than just random houses. Especially because of the infrastructure, you're going to be able to build better infrastructure for the community. And at the end of the day, people are going to take care of what they love. And what do they care about? Community. Helping each other. So they don't need the federal funding to come in, they could do it themselves.
Emilio, we talk a lot about recovery, but communities that really aim to be resilient need to really consider all elements of a disaster cycle. You were talking about this a bit earlier. But that really includes preparedness, response, recovery, and the mitigation. In your opinion, what steps has Puerto Rico taken to really prepare for any potential disaster and give confidence to investors in that regard?
I think several steps have been taken in terms of having a better infrastructure. We talk about the energy sector, which it's really one of the challenges that we have in Puerto Rico. We're moving the system to a market solution, which is very important to do so, but this is a long time affair. I think that there are programs to take care of communities, how Ricardo was saying, how can we mitigate for future disasters. There's a roadmap to do that. For example, we have the Army Corps of Engineers is doing a flood control project or accelerating a flood control project here in San Juan and in Tuabaja and Dorado communities, which will take out of the flood zone tens of thousands of families, which is better prepared to do that. I think the opportunity for the communities is on preparedness. And how can they better be prepared and be oriented or have the knowledge to be prepared for the next one. And it's a very individual decision. What makes sense to a community in San Juan probably is not the same that would make it in Utuado or Ponce or Mayagüez or Fajardo. So I think that giving the tools to the communities to be better prepared, and I think I don't want to beat the hammer too much on the not-for-profits, but I think the not-for-profits have been very good at going at the community and individual level, helping them understand and be prepared for the next one.
Incidentally, talking about helping communities be able to prepare, Invest Puerto Rico actually right after the earthquake in January set up a website. It's called Puerto Rico Sigue, and in there is a recovery guidebook to help communities during this cycle. So it definitely is up to, it's not just the government, it really is all the different sectors kind of chiming in to really prepare the communities for these types of events going forward. So I want to talk about media and going back to that theme about dispelling myths, right? So Puerto Rico, as you all know, we've definitely been in the limelight for a variety of reasons. Ricardo, I know you've been very vocal in media, and I want to ask you, what do you think has been the biggest misconception about Puerto Rico?
Well, the biggest one is the fact that only 35% of the people in the mainland knew Puerto Ricans were U.S. citizens. That was shocking to me when I saw those numbers. So when you were actually talking about Puerto Rico, most people did not understand what the relationship was between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. So in a way, the disaster, showcased Puerto Rico in many ways. The fact that we were invited to speak everywhere in the U.S. just to talk about Puerto Rico tells you that there's a serious interest. So just to answer your question very simply, for me, that was the most telling thing. And that's what made me realize that we had a long way to go, and we had, all of us have a responsibility, because everyone that even visits Puerto Rico becomes an ambassador of Puerto Rico. And I think it's our job. And I don't think people sometimes realize the impact words have. So when you say things like, well, you know, Puerto Rico, oh, you know, we could be doing better. Of course we could. I mean, I'm sure,
there's always room for improvement.
Right, I mean,
always.
I'm pretty sure you could ask my wife and she'll give you a whole list of things I need to improve every single minute. I mean, it's fine. We can improve, but let's focus on the things that we're doing okay. Let's focus on the things that makes us unique. Listen, I have 3 daughters. I don't want to move from Puerto Rico. The education level that we were lucky enough to afford, the fact that every time I get my friends and I talk to them on the phone and they're, you know, 5 inches under snow, I mean, there's something to be said about the fact that we have an incredible natural experience every time we wake up. So, you know, and I'll say this, there was a couple years ago, we had there was a reporter from CNBC. He was honest enough and said, well, you know, I was supposed to go to the Dominican Republic, and last minute they told me I had to come to Puerto Rico. That was actually, that was before the hurricane, by the way. And I was like, oh, Puerto Rico, I want to go to the Dominican Republic. And after a week in the island, he basically said, you know, off the record, I have to tell you something. And he used his words, by the way. He said, you people have no idea how lucky you are. And I was like, whoa. You know, he could say it, I couldn't say it because he would quote me and then I'll get my ass kicked. But what he was basically saying is true. My wife always says that it's very hard to look at the label of a bottle when you're inside it. You have to get outside of the bottle so you can see and then see the label. So when you put yourself out there and they see what we are, it's just the opportunities are here now. What we do with them is our fault. That's why we have a responsibility to do things right. That's why when you ask me about the private sector, you know what? We have an obligation to do things correctly. And I mean it, not because the private sector is corrupt. It's just that it's, you know, we all have to pay our taxes. The level of informal, you know, the informal economy in this island is too big. But why is that? Is it because Puerto Ricans are lazy? No. The bureaucracy sometimes is so difficult that it basically forces people to go into the shadows of the informal economy. And no one has forced us to come up with that bureaucracy. We did that to ourselves. So we have a chance to do it right. But the biggest thing is the fact that we have to start to love ourselves and not have to have other people come in and remind us. We have to remind ourselves every day. So we're not surprised when other people come in and say, wow, Puerto Rico is fantastic.
And Ricardo, I know, you've done work, at the local level and at the national level and in places like Florida and Virgin Islands, and talking about, could you compare the advantages and disadvantages of doing business in Puerto Rico vis-a-vis these other places that you've had the opportunity to work in?
Well, I can tell you, listen, we've done work in crazy places. I say crazy because we've done work in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And what I mean this is that they have no codes. They basically kind of use the US codes. So when it comes to codes in the island, we have everything you could have. We have the vertical and horizontal. We have wind, and wind loads, and we have earthquake, seismic codes. So people should know that the codes are there and they have been around for a while. So I can tell you that the quality of the technicians when it comes to architects and engineers are very, very good in Puerto Rico. If I go back to the fact that we have that, Law 20, we have an office in Miami, and we started to reduce our team in Miami just because of the fact that we actually export services. And every single one of our projects, we focus now more on affordable housing when it comes to Texas, South Carolina, Florida, and Virgin Islands. And the level of expertise that we've learned because of the hurricane and the disasters is incredible. Yes. Really, no one understands community development block grants, disaster recovery better than us. And we are going to be able to export those services for years to come. Yes. So I would say that my experience has been mostly positive everywhere we go when it comes to the quality of the product. The biggest difference, in my personal opinion, is the permitting. It's a little convoluted here, and people get afraid of how convoluted they could be. But I can tell you that I've never felt that we weren't ready to do any of the projects in the US. And I'm not including, to be fair, Latin America or Middle East, because they're way behind when it comes to actually construction methods in contrast to the US. So I haven't encountered anything but validation, and that creates a little bit of confidence, not overconfidence. But sometimes what happens, and I'm sure you can relate to this, is basically you go there and you don't know. So you're going for the first time to do some work in some of these places. And what it has done for us as a company is that it's giving us validation. Though we might not be the best in the world, but we can compete, and that's what we ask.
Yeah, and also learning is a continuous process. So I think these last few years we've had some transfer of knowledge on how things are done, and how do we deal with disaster recovery, and how do we move forward. And I think there is a lot of opportunity from business and professionals here to go outside the comfort zone, get outside of the 110 by 35 and replicate what we've learned in the last 30 months outside of the island, be it in the mainland US or through our neighbors. There's a lot of opportunity. I always say the academia could be involved and do a resiliency, not only clinic, but we could be the resiliency example for the world and to help the region. Because what we've learned is that not all of the things that come from the kitchen recipe really adapt to Puerto Rico. And because we do have the professional capabilities to understand what makes sense, what can be adopted and what can be adapted, which are two very similar words. They only have one vowel in difference, but it makes a world of difference in meaning. Adapting and adapt, and how can we take advantage of those techniques that we are acquiring
and becoming nimble with an entrepreneurship mentality, because you have to be ready.
Right, and how are we going to move forward and basically export these kinds of techniques to the region and the rest of the world.
And I think that goes back to what I was mentioning earlier about the value proposition. We've heard historically about the incentives and the fact that we're a U.S. jurisdiction and we've got the bilingual workforce, but we've got much more than that right now, right? We've got to kind of evolve beyond that, and the fact that we've been through all this and that we actually were resilient people. It's a resilient now economy. And couple that with, I see invest with a purpose, and Ricky, I do really love that tagline, because I do think that part of our value proposition right now is that your money here means more. You're actually being part, and you're contributing in a very meaningful way, and that's not something you can necessarily say about New York or San Francisco. So it really has become part, and should become part of that value proposition. It's actually something that our team at Invest Puerto Rico is really considering when we promote Puerto Rico as an investment destination. So I'm being told that our time is up, but I do want to thank you, Ricardo and Emilio, for being part of this panel. And thank you, Ricky, for inviting us. It was a pleasure to be here.